Good evening, everybody. My name is Yar Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very honored to welcome Chaitali Sen in conversation with Soniah Kamal for a celebration of a new race of men from heaven. The stories in a new race of men from heaven move elegantly between the ache of loneliness and the grace of connection, however fleeting. That's a quote from Danielle Evans, who's one of our favorite writers, who wrote The Office of Historical Corrections. And we're so excited to be here with both of these folks. We're here with local fave Soniah Kamal. Soniah is an award-winning novelist, essayist, and public speaker. Her most recent novel, Unmarriageable, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, is a Financial Times Reader's Best Book of 2019, the 2019 Books All Georgians Should Read, the 2020 Georgia Author of the Year for Literary Fiction nominee. It is shortlisted for the 2020 Townsend Award for Fiction, is a New York Public Library and NPR Code Switch 2019 Summer Read Pick, and a People's Magazine pick. Soniah's TEDx talk about second chances and We Are the Ink. Her address at a U.S. citizenship oath ceremony talks about immigrants and the real American dreams. Soniah's work has appeared in critically acclaimed anthologies and publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, BuzzFeed, and more. You can follow her online at www.soniahkamal.com, and I'll drop that in the chat for our folks watching at home. And the person of the hour tonight is Chaitali Sen, who is the author of the novel The Pathless Sky, and the story collection that we're celebrating tonight, A New Race of Men from Heaven, which was selected by Danielle Evans as the winner of the Mary McCarthy Prize for Short Fiction. Her work has appeared in Boulevard, Catapult, Colorado Review, Ecotone, Los Angeles Review of Books, New England Review, and many other publications. She holds an MFA from Hunter College and lives in Central Texas. So we're so honored to get to celebrate this beautiful book. It's from Sarah Brand, which is a favorite press of ours. So we were talking just before it began about what a wonderful press Sarah Brand Books is. We're always glad to get to celebrate work from presses that we think are doing great things in the world. So for folks watching at home, if you'd like to ask questions, you may do that at any time, and we'll vocalize those when the time comes. But for the moment, I'm going to hand it over to Soniah to get us going. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Yar and Charis Books. It's an absolute pleasure to be here interviewing Chaitali for her short story collection, which has some of such lovely stories. And it's been a joy to read the collection after having read your novel, The Pathless Sky. There's some stories in here which have thematic reflections for that, but some of them are so different. So I'd love to get into how you came up with these stories versus a little bit about the novel also. So what I'd like to begin with is if you will please, from a story of your choice, just give us a little bit of a reading.
Okay, thank you. And I'm so honored to be here at Charis Books with Soniah Kamal, whose book Unmarriageable is just one of my favorite novels. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure, thank you.
I'm going to read from the title story, which is the last story in the book. I guess I'll just start from the beginning and read a few pages. Now this story actually takes place in England, and I'm not good at accents, but the narrator is a British Indian woman. But I'm just gonna do it in my American accent. You'll have to suspend disbelief as you're listening. But when you're reading it yourself, you should imagine a very polished British accent. So, I decided to seek counseling because I wanted to sleep with a man from my office, an engineer with hazel eyes and auburn hair cut close to his scalp, a slightly receding chin and a quite large nose, and one dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. He came to us from Glasgow to manage the electrical component of the Heathrow Terminal 5 project. Every time he stopped by the finance department, he would hover by my desk and engage me in suggestive banter. Once I said, "I'll have the report run by the end of the day. Be sure to grab me before you leave." And he said, I will, I'll grab you. And we both laughed. I wondered if he was married, and I discovered, by procuring his personnel file from a temporary admin assistant in HR, that Ned was not married. He was only horrendously busy with the electrical infrastructure of the Heathrow project. We'd been flirting harmlessly all those months until the day he began talking about Palms of Goa, an Indian restaurant on Charlotte Street close to our office. He was asking me to lunch. I don't like Indian restaurants, I blurted. I shook my head and tried to recover. You're thinking this must be some kind of racial self-hatred. The truth is, my mother is English, and my father died when I was 16. It doesn't have to be Indian, he said. I wanted to clarify that I disliked Indian restaurants, not Indian food, and certainly not Indian people. We went to an Indian restaurant for my 10th birthday. It didn't go well. My mother said the food was too spicy and she fussed at the waiter. We mustn't recreate bad childhood memories, he said. One of my best mates is Kashmiri. I've had lovely meals with her family. He nodded wearily. Italian then? I can't, I said. I had meant to say today. I can't today. I needed a little time, a day or two, to prepare for lunch with him. He backed away from my desk, undoing his strident approach. I almost cried watching him retreat. After that, his avoidance of me was brutal.
Hey, thank you. So I think I was going to go in order, but since you've read from A New Race of Men from Heaven, which is the last story in the collection, I'd like to know, and I'd like to know for all the stories, but what's your, where you got the idea from, a little bit about the process, you know.
Yeah. So I actually did get the idea for this story from that little bit of dialogue. I was in a office. My sister and I were visiting London. We were in her friend's office waiting for her to come down, and there were two employees in the lobby having a conversation, a man and a woman, and that this exact bit of dialogue took place where she said, just grab me before you leave, and he said, I will, I'll grab you, and like everybody laughed. It was just like one of those moments, and this was before Me Too, and
when you could make grabbing jokes.
And then, we had walked through Greenwich, a part of London now, where, there was the Royal Naval College in Greenwich Mean Time and everything. And when I was walking around there, I was looking at all the kind of like landmarks and the monuments to the empire. And I just was thinking, it's just so odd that we're here, these brown women are here because of all of this. So that sort of started the story. So I was thinking about like an office romance, and there's more to it than that.
Yes, you can call it an office romance. What ends up, unfolding in the story
Doesn't go well.
It's definitely romantic with a twist.
Mhm.
Lots of twists. There's
Yeah.
romance, but there's a lot of other stuff. But just listening to what propelled the story into being, I think it's even more poignant and interesting where you have the sentence, which you read out also, that I wanted to clarify that I disliked Indian restaurants, not Indian food, and certainly not Indian people. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because this story is very much about identity. The protagonist's mother is from England, but then the therapist she ends up seeing, she's also biracial. Her father is, I believe, Indian also, but her mother's from Wales. She's Welsh. And even that, because a lot of times we tend to think of everyone from Great Britain as just English. So I thought that particular twist and how you broke down even further identities within a certain greater country was very interesting and brought a lot of nuance to the story too. So I'd like to know what it is about Indian restaurants she doesn't like, and just your thoughts about identity and how they can be broken down, and how sometimes we tend to generalize. Because I think a lot of the story is about identity generalization versus specificity.
Yeah. Well, I think this story is entirely about identity. so it's just layers and layers of complications, and there's like a final layer that she doesn't really discover till later in her life. But so her father is Indian, her mother is English, and she doesn't actually, I didn't read this part, but she doesn't actually know that she's Indian, or like she doesn't know what any of that means until she's 9 years old, and she suddenly hears her father speaking Punjabi to another, to a tourist, and the therapist is, and the actual complication in the story is that she's 28 years old, she's a virgin, and she doesn't know why. So there's
Not for lack of trying.
No.
She just ends up that she keeps.
So, you know, she was very close to her father. Her father died when she was 16. So I think some of it is, this is, you know, I don't know where like stuff comes from, but when the in the restaurant, I kind of saw it as like, this is something that she wanted to try, as like trying to be a family that embraces that part of the identity, and it didn't go well. So
Yeah, no, I like the way the story explores how she's pulled between these two different parts of her, and she seems to know about the layers without really knowing about the layers, you know, which is what the story is about. What does it mean to be different when you're not really sure why you're different? And also the whole narrative with her sexuality is very interesting also, and just the layers of, it's very much a story that deals with what we're hearing so much in the zeitgeist, which is trauma. It's very much a story about trauma and intergenerational trauma and what that can mean given your identity and different identities. So I really enjoyed it in that regard. Okay, I wanted to know what, if it's fair to ask this, because maybe it's like asking someone what their favorite child was. But what is your favorite story, or do you have one, or one that approaches favorite in all of these?
Yeah, it is like asking about your favorite child. You know, it depends on the day, but the title story is definitely, probably most of the time my favorite.
Okay. Any particular, was it easier to write? Did it just, was it eavesdropping for writers, as we know, can be beneficial. So this did start off with.
Yeah, it was fun to write. You know, it was fun to write, and it was a story where I just kept discovering things as I was writing, and I, like, up until I had the final version, I was still discovering things about this story, and it was still surprising me. So, you know, I still enjoy it for that reason, and the setting, and the I like the narrator. But if I had to pick I don't know if I have a second favorite. At different times, you know, I actually like that nobody ever talks about it, but I like The Matchstick by Charles Tilly a lot.
You know, it was, that is actually almost read to me like flash fiction, because the other story, it was shorter than the other stories in here. How do you, I'd love to know how you put, did you, was there any thought process in particular that went towards how you were going to collect the stories together? And then in that regard, how did the matchstick end up being where it is? So
I'm surprised the matchstick stayed in. I'm glad it did. But I knew that I wanted The Immigrant to be the first story. Because I think it's sort of a story also about storytelling, and being lost, which is also you know, a theme of the book, but it's about telling fictions, you know, the letter that he's writing to his parents about this woman who, you know, making more of it than it is, and then the story that he's going to tell at the end about to this woman that he likes. And I knew that I wanted A New Race of Men from Heaven to be the last story. So those were
any particular?
I think because of the migration aspect, and it seemed to me to have the most sort of kind of like final, it sounded the most like a final story that like sort of puts a punctuation mark on this exploration of migration and colonialism.
No, I think it's interesting that you brought up the word lost, because definitely in The Immigrant, in the first story, there is a little child that keeps getting lost. She keeps wandering off, and everyone then ends up panicking as to where she is. And it just occurred to me that how interesting that the very last story that you've put in the collection, the one you just read from, that also in effect has a little girl who has been lost and yet is found by the main character in the end. So in a way, those bookends definitely do fit with thematically when it comes to being lost and being found, and who's losing you and who's finding you also. So that's really, that was
I didn't even think about that girl being lost in the final story.
You know, it didn't occur to me when I was reading it right now, just hearing you talk about it being lost and then bookending those. So I was like, yeah, you know, she's lost in some respects, but then in a way, another character finds herself in the end. So that definitely does, especially if you read it chronologically, which I don't know, what are your thoughts about short story collections, and should the stories be read chronologically or not? Because I feel that a lot of times the writers put them in a certain order for a certain reason. It's not just, you know, because length works here, it doesn't work here. What do you think, if with your collection and others, is it a good idea to read them chronologically, or just pick some? Because I know sometimes people are like, what's the shortest story? In your case, Charles Tilly, which would be the one they would read first then. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think it depends. If it's like a big anthology of someone's work, like the collected stories of Cheever, I don't think you have to read those chronologically. I think with modern collections, they are sort of curated in a certain way and ordered in a certain way. So I think you do get something from reading it chronologically that you wouldn't get reading it out.
There's an overall arc that the storyteller is telling. So in with that in mind, where does the matchstick by Charles Tilly come into place?
Well, so it is seemingly doesn't belong, but you know, that story is also about it's also, I think, about being lost. It's about you know, an author who's really not at the pinnacle of his career, and then finds out that someone has written a story using his name.
Right, and then what happens with that? I don't, as much as I want to really get into this and unfold the plot, I also want readers to, you know, get to the stories themselves because they're so lovely. I would actually love for you to read the first paragraph of The Matchstick by Charles Tilly. Which, and here the title is very telling, and you know what's telling about it once you actually get to the end of the story.
The night I found out about the story, my daughter and her husband, who is 22 years her senior, had invited me over for dinner at the brownstone they'd just bought in Brooklyn Heights. This was more comfort than I could have imagined for her, a 3-story townhouse with an 18-foot coffered ceiling, the kind of place I used to linger beneath on the sidewalks of my youth, stealing views through picturesque windows of crown molding and crystal chandeliers, and my God, is that a wall of bookshelves with a rolling ladder? She couldn't have done it on her own, not at her age. Her husband is the director of an important New York cultural institution. I won't say the name, but it begins with a W. She was an intern there, and without any intention or effort, I know this deep in my soul, she managed to end his marriage and begin her own life with him. I actually did, I think, start writing this story when I was temping at the Whitney.
Okay, well now we know what you're referring to. So where did the genesis for this particular story or this particular character come from? And I think it's for me it was really interesting also to read a story which at least went into a father who's seeing his younger daughter marry someone who's almost his age, give and take. And that was a very interesting perspective. We don't necessarily usually tend to see that. And he seems very comfortable with it, which I thought was interesting also.
Yeah, so I think this was a story I wrote about New York. I think I started it when I was still living in New York. Where I lived, I got my MFA there, I lived there, I taught there for 12 years, and a few of these stories are set in New York. And I think I was at a book event where sort of an established author, but not somebody everyone had heard of, like not a best-selling author, was talking like in conversation with another author, and it was a little like, it was like 2004, 2005 maybe, and the world had changed, all these like sort of cataclysmic things that happened, like 9/11, the Iraq War, but these two authors it seemed like they were kind of stuck in the 90s, and it was just there was something sad about it, like they just there was like a little bit of a level of panic, like, do we have anything to say anymore?
Okay.
So that was what I know, like I wanted to write about somebody kind of going through that. The premise, or maybe the gimmick of somebody writing in his name, I'm not sure where that came from, but once you come up with that, then
Sure.
you're off to the races.
Why Charles Tilly? Just any particular
I don't
reason
know,
Charles
yeah.
just came to and
Yeah,
it seemed right?
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, all right. Or matchstick, which though is symbolic, right? Because matches, flames,
Mhm.
I used to be an ex-literature student. I know how to read symbolism in anything. But there often is. Okay. So let's go back to The Immigrant for a second, which was your first story. Again, where did you get the idea for that? Was that one, is this one of the, I'm assuming Charles Tilly was written in like you said, in New York, so a little earlier, an earlier story, versus when was this one written? In what
This
stage
one
of your
was
life?
I think I was in Austin, I think it was 2009 or 2010 that I wrote this one, maybe later. Yeah, that one was, it's just, as a writer, you're just like constantly picking up little tidbits of things, and I was in this restaurant, and a lot of these things, thankfully a child didn't go missing, but there was a child walking around with a big menu, and all the stuff with the light, the dust coming down from the lights over the food. So it came from the couple arguing outside. All of those things actually happened in one night.
Okay.
And so this is actually one of the stories that I think I wrote the fastest. And it got picked up really fast. It got published fast.
So you left the restaurant and started writing at the
Probably
restaurant?
that week. Yeah, no, not at the restaurant. I was there with somebody, but yeah, probably that week I started writing it.
Okay. Right. So your second story, when I heard The Learned Astronomer, one of my favorites, but it reminded me a lot of your novel also, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your novel, what it's about, as well as if you agree with me that there are mirrors within this story and your novel, and what came first, what was written first, or when was this situated in the writing of
Yeah. So this story, there was a version that was a failed version of the story, and I was telling people at my launch in Austin that story, like when you're reading like classic literature like Dickens or Tolstoy or somebody, sometimes they go to a town or they're traveling somewhere. I don't know if this resonates with anybody in this audience, but they'll just put the first name, the first letter of the town, and then it's a dash, but for some reason they can't reveal the name of that town. And I was like, what is that about? So I wanted to write a story that's set in that town. And then, obviously then I had to come up with an actual story. And I was really interested at that time in the whole debate or, just what was going on with the teaching of evolution.
Mhm.
And so, then the college, things sort of unfolded. But from there, it wasn't working as a story, and I started writing a novel for many reasons, and I decided to also set that in an unnamed, totally fictional place. And it is also about a scientist, but it took a totally different direction. So you're right that there is a relation, and then later I went back to the story and figured out what I wanted to write about.
So this is the parent
Mhm.
of the novel
Yeah.
in many respects. Yeah, because even with your female protagonist here, certain things happen to her in here, which very much happen in the
Yeah.
novel also. So your novel, like you said, and is set in a nameless country. But you do give certain geographical feelers. We hear about Alexandria, and so we can sort of, the reader has a sense of where it is. Why did you choose a nameless place? And if I may say, you could have perhaps chosen to set it against one of the numerous wars that have taken place with India or Bangladesh or in Bengal or just in that particular geographical area where you yourself belong to. So what was the reason then to not do that per se?
I think I just wanted to be freed from any actual real research. I didn't grow up in India, but some of that novel actually is about India. It's also about Americans. I didn't want to write about Americans. I didn't really, I feel like maybe I have the authority to write about Indians, but I wanted that situation, sort of a uneven, unequal societal relation, and so I just went for it. And if I hadn't gone for it, I probably would not have finished the novel. So.
Okay, so it gave you a certain freedom, a certain license to not. Yeah, research can be really tough because you feel the responsibility of keeping things as they were and true, and not really letting imagination per se come in. But having read that and having read both of the, having read the story also, even though the places may be nameless and stuff, there's such a unique sense of the setting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're able to evoke that. Where just like you said in your first story, the sunlight and the dust and the particles and stuff, it was just interesting to me, having read both of them, and them being nameless, how I was yet able to situate them in a lot of conflict zones around the world. And I think by perhaps not naming them, there's a certain timeless quality to the novel, and as well as to the story. I mean, I have to say, I think my own proclivities are obvious for what sort of literature and stuff I like reading, but beautifully done novel and the story too. I think you handled this sort of political strife and identity, and like you said, the inequality of people and what passports mean and don't mean, and really how people suffer because of government decisions or non-decisions, and yet how they manage to still go along, but all the losses along the way, losses of relationships and the loss of love and what that means with decisions we're forced to make or not forced to make. So yeah, I know you a little while back called A Pathless Sky a love novel, and there's very much a lot of love in it, but for me it's also about the lack of love countries might have for their citizens, and how love has sometimes to be hardened when it comes to relatives and relations who have to make very difficult decisions in order to survive.
Yeah.
So, and this story was very much that also. So
thank you. That's wonderful.
Okay, so now we will turn to. I wanted to know that you'd also just mentioned that the matchstick nearly didn't make it in the collection. Why was that?
Well, I had it in there. I just was 2 stories were cut from the collection. One was just more of a historical kind of, it just didn't fit. And then the other one wasn't really a story. It was a chapter from a novel. So so we cut it down to these 8, and I knew that something would be cut, and I was just glad.
So
I never wanted to cut it, but
Yeah.
I was afraid the editor might And she didn't, so that was
You're glad Tilly made it in.
Yeah.
Okay, so Uma, when was Uma written, and where did the idea for that come in? Because you can tell us a little about that, because I found this very fascinating, and it's set in the 1970s, so slightly different time period, before social media, before a lot of easier communication, and people perhaps feeling a little more isolated in the atrocities or the widow. I mean, your main character becomes a widow fairly early in the story. So just talk about how did you come about this idea?
This was my earliest story. I started working on it in the 90s. I think there were some widows in my family, so I was kind of interested in widows and what they have to do to survive. And then, more than hearing about probably, I heard a little bit about independence. We never heard anything about partition, but I always heard about Naxalites growing up. So, my family, I feel like it just came up a lot. They talked about it a lot, and then, in the 90s, I learned a little bit more about what that was about. And so, so, a lot of storytelling is like two things coming together, like multiple interests coming together. So it was the Naxalites and the widowhood, and then coming to America. And a lot of that is also thinking about my childhood, and how one of my beloved aunts visited me when I was a kid, and, she was, to me, she was just my caretaker for a little while, but.
Would she sing you the lullaby that you've mentioned?
She sang to me, not that lullaby, but she would sing to me, and we were like the best of friends.
Yeah. No, I mean, I found this story very quite fascinating because, your main character becomes a widow, and that is interesting how that happens. But also then she manages to get to the US, where she almost, on the one hand, one might say that she has a certain sort of freedom because she's here now, at least, and that's how coming to the US or a different country from India is sold to her. But on the other hand, when she comes here, she turns almost into a nanny, into a domestic worker at the relative's house that she comes to. What I found also very contemporary, though, was that let's just say the brother's house that she comes to, his wife works, she's a doctor. So I found that juxtaposition really interesting, that here we have a woman who is working, earning her own money and stuff, which in our contemporary times is the thing to do. And then we have this other woman who's found a certain freedom also, but she has become the unpaid domestic worker. So the exploration of what it means to be free, and which woman sees herself as free at the end of the story, is really very fascinating, because it goes against our perceived conceptions of what it means to be free, to be independent, to be looked after, even. So,
I thought of this just, the number of women who are very educated and yet are, their main role in life has been to be the caretaker.
Yeah.
And so I'm always interested in that kind of character too, and how and so her role doesn't actually change that much from India to the US. So.
Right, but I still think that for me, the fact of widowhood has got to change her life a lot. And then she gets this, had she, let's say she would have remained in India, what sort of a life might she have had there? Would she have turned into a domestic helper, or would she have turned into someone who became a liability insofar? Because here, even though she's not earning any money, she still has a sense, I think she does, of contributing in a way, even if it doesn't earn any money. I mean, I just think the whole relationships between the two women, between what she's doing, not doing, and also her bid for freedom at the end of it and how it's taken. I just like the way you've explored what it means to be free and what it means to, I don't even want to say trapped, what it means to be not free when it comes to family relationships. Like, does family offer you freedom, or does family offer you being caged, but in a different way, and how the protagonist navigates those states of being. So, okay, so the next story is North, South, East, West. So can you talk a little about that?
So this story is actually set in New York, but also unnamed, and also all the characters are unnamed.
Yes.
And
I actually was gonna ask, why again did you choose to have no names for any of the characters?
I think in this story I was really thinking completely in terms of the relationships between the characters. So just the person who's defined as the mother, the person who's defined as the father. A lot of it is about their roles, and then there's these two children who are twins, and there was something kind of archetypal to me, and I couldn't actually imagine it. I'm not sure I even considered trying to name them. It just, the voice came out in this way. So, but I think it's.
What about the title?
So this used to be called The Abandoned, and it was published as The Abandoned, and then my brilliant editor suggested that it should be titled North, South, East, West, which I really love. And that comes from the mother talking about the gates of Baghdad at the end. But I think this is very much about freedom, migration, and your circumstances, where you're stuck, and so much of that in our world is, depending on which direction you end up going or where you are to begin with. So.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of one of the major themes throughout the stories was about being emotionally abandoned, even if you are in a relationship, and what that means, and what it means to take ownership of where your life has been, or what you're choosing for your life to be. I mean, even with Charles Tilly, I think it's the most different story out of the whole collection per se, but even there, that was the sense of ownership and identity, and in this story's case, about how instead of a husband or a wife or children, but just the act of storytelling, and whose story is it, and what that means. So it fit in that way for me, definitely. Okay, now we come to another favorite story of mine, which I really I laughed a lot through it too, and that is The Cat Legs. So can you tell us a little about this most interesting story where couples from very different walks and ways of life manage to live in the same, I think, in front of each other,
Their
neighborhood, yeah.
This is my post-Trump story, my post-2016 election story. I just was living in Texas. This is not set in Texas, but you are living there were such different views. You can be living side by side with people who have completely different views of the election and what it meant, and a lot of just kind of dismissal of people's fears, and so but also I was thinking a lot about how people's convictions, people sort of have convictions, and they either stay with them or they don't.
I mean, the story seems to it's set in Ithaca, in Cornell, and here I was most amused by your absolute specificity. Given a lot of the stories are nameless, either characters or place settings, but here you're dead on specific. But also, it's really a story about the gay couple who are professors, and then your other couple who, can you talk about them a little bit?
Yes.
Because I think the contradictions that you bring up with them is what is the crux of the story and what makes it so enjoyable also. And again, I think it's a story about, in some respects, identity, abandonment, wanting connection. It almost feels like the couples, or at least this one couple, this one wife here really wants connection or is trying to understand. And just the it's a lovely story and just the complexity of that, so.
Yeah, so this is a lesbian couple, and they, a family has moved in next door, the Catholics, and it's a woman and her husband and 8 children. And you know, there's a lot actually unsaid. The Lori and Sharmila sort of are guessing that they might be Trump supporters. It's not clear. And then they have a weekend with their friends from New York, and the mother, Kiki, from the Catholic family, and they're sort of hip Catholics. She comes over to spend some time. It's not clear why. They give her a tour of the house.
And her husband's a musician, so he's away on tour. I just found that whole, because if you didn't, I think the academic couple, when they visit the house in the beginning and they see all the crosses everywhere, they start to make certain assumptions. And I thought that was also very interesting, how you turned around and turned around who in this story is making those assumptions, right? It's more the liberal couple which is suddenly making all these assumptions, and you never tell us whether their assumptions are necessarily right or not. But you have the musician, and on the face of it, this couple with their 8 children look really cool, but they're homeschooling and they're doing a lot of things which immediately, even to the reader, seems to, it makes the reader go to certain assumptions also. So I thought you very beautifully did that, where even the reader started making assumptions without really any clues as to this couple, and then you bring up Joanna Gaines, and I thought that was, and a lot of us, I'm sure, have seen them on their home improvement show, and I thought that was a really funny touch
Yeah,
too.
the cult of domestication.
Yes.
I thought Danielle Evans actually really wrote very sharply. She did the intro to this story for Electric Literature, and she asked a question like, do personal relationships help you cope with injustices, or have you or make you look away from them? And that was sort of at the end. Kiki says something that can be interpreted in a lot of ways, but I think that was actually sort of the underlying question, like when you think that something, because this couple in the beginning is the sort of they want to change things, they want to be activists, and then you sort of learn to cope and accept things through renovating your house or making friends with your neighbors, or and there's nothing wrong with any of that, but just there's a certain level of self-delusion about how much you're gonna fight things. I think so. That's sort of something I was interested in exploring.
Yeah. No, I think what struck me with that story, and a few others also, but particularly this one, is how you're able to evoke how tumultuous people's feelings were at that time, and how they were scared for what it could mean. But having some hindsight also, I think the way the story ends, where I don't want to spoil it by saying how it ends, but it almost seems to be the big mystery of life in a way, right? Which is a lot of stuff can happen and yet the sun comes out the next day. And what does that mean? What does that mean for the people who have been traumatized or who have gone through horrible things? And what does that mean for those who haven't? How do people reconcile? Really, I think the theme of that story, very beautifully done, is how do you reconcile with your different lives and your different experiences when you are living side by side, and perhaps even though the same sun is shining on you, it is not the same sun, really, right? Someone can be shivering even in the sun because they've had not a good time and they're scared. And some people are just, happily having a good time. So the story really does bring that up. And I think it's really another favorite of mine, lovely story about how you're able to capture all the different lives and nuances within that. Then the penultimate story is A Century Ends. And this was also a story about friendship, very beautifully written and done. And your main tell us about that. I mean, your main character, Laura, again, she's Indian, and then you have her friendship. I mean, I was really interested and struck by how many different characters of color and different characters from different walks of life are in the different stories. And they have friendships which last or don't last, and what friendship even means in terms of people who have come from different walks of life. And I'll go back to the story for a second. Remind me which one it is. It is the one, I think it's the last one. We'll get to that again. But just where, again, just the fact that one of the protagonist's mother is English and the therapist's mother is Welsh, even that gives them a gap, or at least the protagonist said that, well, her mother's not English, so she can't understand mine. And it was just really interesting to see within all the stories, again, they're about identity, but also how you have written about connections between these identities, but also the gaps within these identities. And for me, this particular story, A Century Ends, is very much, instead of the connection, which is what the last story we just talked about, the Catholics, might be about, for me, the story was very much about the gaps and how those gaps are created. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wanted to write a story about a dissolving friendship, and sort of when you think you're not abandoning somebody, but you are, and you don't realize the ways that you're abandoning that person or just not connecting. And so, these are two women who really have no idea what's going on with each other. And they were teachers together and have very different ideas about what to do with their lives, but also I think recognize things in each other that they don't see themselves. And
did you ever go to any sort of yoga retreat like these two do?
Not like this one, but I did. I went to a Reiki training thing in suburban Pennsylvania, and it was a little bit like this, but just I think there's also like sort of different ideas about self-care and
right. I mean, you also you explore also, I think, or at least very much touch upon the nature, like you said, and the stories about friendships, but what it means to have a work friendship. Does that friendship, if your friendships are based on certain, your workplace or where you teach certain areas like that, does it survive when one of you is no longer in that place or moves away or has different ideas? So I thought that was really interesting also.
Yeah, and not letting someone make a choice about their lives. Laura definitely has feelings about Jane leaving the profession.
Yeah, but June seems very angry at Laura also for several reasons. So there was a lot of tension between them, which came across really beautifully. I really liked it. And then it's about Laura teaching children, and the century ends. Actually, the theme of their school's year or whatever is A Century Ends. And I just thought it was the way the story unfolds, what that means for children who haven't, perhaps, how old are they in this? 5, 6 or so? Something, so kindergarten or around elementary school. And I just thought that, again, the juxtaposition, the paradox of how do you explain a century, let alone do a project, to kids for whom 1 year is perhaps a century, let alone trying to explain 100 years to them of something. So all of that was, it came across really, it was a very interestingly explored time and what it means to adults and to children, and how do you bridge those things together. which brings us back to the last story. And I think, again, given all the things you've said about the other stories, I can see why you probably put the last story in there. And I think sometimes with collections, the very last story and the very last sentence. So for me, I think, at least I try to connect it to the overall arc of the connection. And over here, I think it really does fit with it. It may be the last sentence of the story, but I think also it does capture the essence of the last sentence of the collection. But honestly, I think your novel does. You know, your novel, of course, with a novel, it's different. A novel is about particular characters and everything, but that also beautifully encapsulates an entire theme. But you are able to write loss and the meaning of loss really provocatively and very poignantly.
Thank you.
Also, I think your great strength with writing is you're very precise with the language, and there's no moments of the reader wondering, why is this written here? What does this mean? Where are we going? So it's really, you know, your language, it's very very wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think last sentences are very important. So
Yeah.
I spend quite a bit of time on them, whether it's a story or a novel. It has to sound like an end to me.
How do you know it's the end though? Like, how do you get a feeling that, okay, this is the last sentence, or do your endings, like for oftentimes when I write, whether it's a short story or whatever I'm working on, for some reason I always know the ending. I know the ending, and usually the very last sentence or paragraph just comes to me. And then I know that I have to write towards that. And even if I don't end up with that ending, at least that's the impetus for getting the rest of the story out. I don't know why that happens. I mean, if someone was to ask me why, I'd be like, don't know. But do you know?
No, I actually need help with my endings. So I always have missteps in my endings. I have false endings all the time. And then, you know, with The Immigrant, it was actually the editor at Colorado Review who said, I like the story, but the ending, can you work on it? And so then I'll work on it, I'll push myself.
Right, you get direction.
But with the novel, I did know how it was gonna end, and I knew the last sentence.
Okay.
I knew that
It just came to you, or you had to think about it, or?
It came to me pretty easily, out of that the mother character. But the last very last sentence of maybe I'll just read
Sure, go ahead.
When I showed them pictures of their grandfather, we could see what was always there, the greatness of the effort, the constant clenching of his heart. You'll have to read the story to know what that means. But I think once I knew what the narrator was going to do or not do, then the last sentence came to me.
So having written both short stories and having written a novel, which one is there any preference? What do you find easier, not easier? Just what is the process for both of them? Like if you, with your next, would you want to do a collection again? Would you veer towards a novel again? Where do you stand with those?
Yeah, I think I like them both equally now. I find short stories really difficult because I'm never really sure what should happen in them, and it's like you have to come up with like 8 plots instead of one. So, but I have sort of an idea of a short story collection that's all based on some travels that I've done.
Okay.
That would be more of maybe a linked collection. But I like writing novels. I think I find them a little bit easier. It's a little bit more natural for me. But I love the form of short stories, so I'm studying them all the time. I read them all the time, and so I would love to, I'd love to be considered a master short storyteller and a short story writer.
So, do we have any questions? Because I don't want to take away from any questions, even as much as I want to continue the conversation.
Well, yes, so could you tell us, did you have any relationship with Danielle Evans in terms of the creation of this book, and what was that like?
I did not. I mean, I love Danielle Evans. I love both her story collections. I'm not sure if the second one was already out when I submitted to this contest. And it was a complete shock to me when Sarah Van called me and said I won a contest. I was like, what? Actually thought it was a joke, but so no, I've never met Danielle Evans. I hope I will one day. I did write her a note, and then I was, just really moved by her introduction to the collection and her introduction to the story that was in Electric Literature, and it just means a lot to me. She is a master of the form, and so, but no, I didn't have any relationship with her.
That's so interesting because it seems like you on the page that she definitely understands your work.
Yeah, she just does.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so one of the things that we always ask at Charis is, who is somebody, either, a contemporary or someone historical that you feel like has really influenced your craft, but maybe would not necessarily be obvious or intuitive that you want to just name or shout out or lift up?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think, it's because it sounds pretentious, right? But the interesting thing about short stories is you grow up, you become a reader through short stories, fairy tales, and the little anthology, the readers that you have in elementary school, and so I think all of those must have had an influence. But when I really first started studying short stories, it was Chekhov, and it sounds silly to compare yourself to Chekhov, but I learned a lot from the story of Cheever and people like that. But there are so many really good short story writers that I've learned from, and Danielle Evans is one of them.
Yeah. Well, Sonia, do you have one more question to close this out?
What question would you like to be asked that you have not been asked? I am often asked this question and I hate it. So I will pass this question and see if you like it any better than I do.
Let's see, a question I'd like to be asked. Well, I'd like to be asked about titles, how I come up with titles.
Yeah.
So I can tell the story of A New Race of Men from Heaven, how that title came to be. And this, just like endings, I also have false starts with titles. So this had a terrible title, this story. And then I was doing research into the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. And there's the painted hall and the paintings in there. There's a big mural of the Royal House of Hanover coming down from heaven in a ship. And so I had read a blog that translated the Latin inscription of that painting as A New Race of Men from Heaven. I think actually the proper translation is A New Generation of Men from Heaven. That's how the Royal Naval College translates it, but I read A New Race of Men from Heaven. I was like, I got it. That's the title.
Nice.
Yeah.
So, in fact, can you quickly tell me, because I'm interested, and I did mean to get to the titles, but why when I heard The Learned Astronomer? Because that's a very interesting title, very different.
Yeah, that's from a Walt Whitman poem.
Okay.
Yeah, so I like getting, a lot of times I will get titles from poems, and that happened to just also be the title of the poem.
No, and it does come up actually in the story. You do give the poem and everything, but what about this particular first line and this particular poem resonated with you for this story?
Yeah, I think because it's a poem about scientists and wonder, science and wonder, and I think that's part of the tension in the story and in general about where do you get wonder from? Is it from religion? Is it from science? Is it from art,
Right,
those
right.
three things. I'm sure there are other things you can get wonder
Yeah.
from, but, so when I found that poem, I thought, it's sort of touching on
Yeah.
those themes.
No, very much. I think this particular story, when I heard the learned astronomer and the Catholics, definitely pair together very well, because they are about in different ways, but they do touch on very similar themes, whether it's wonder or whether it's religion, what that means, what it doesn't mean. They're different stories, but also very related. Now I'm going to do a quick pop questions. Very fast. And first things that come into your mind, because I love knowing this about authors, so I'm going to do it with you too. I ran a little, anyway, okay. Favorite color?
Blue.
No, okay. Favorite animal?
I have to say my dog, Sam.
Tea, coffee, water, wine.
Coffee.
Going down to, or going down to the middle of Earth or going up to space?
Space.
Favorite flower?
Tulip. These are fun.
Yeah, I know, I love asking these. Favorite gemstone?
Aquamarine.
Okay. Birthstone? What's your birthstone?
That's it. My birthstone.
Okay.
I don't have anything that's aquamarine, but I always look at it in the jewelry case.
Okay. Beach or city or mountain?
Oh, that's all right. Not mountain.
Okay.
But beach or city. Beach.
Okay. Loud music, instrumental, what?
Singer, songwriter kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And what instrument? Any instrument you particularly like?
Piano. I would like to learn how to
Okay.
play the piano.
Are you a high heel person, boot person, slippers person, flat shoes person?
Not high heels. Slippers.
Okay, this question comes because I absolutely love shoes. I am my best friend.
I can't wear high heels.
She calls me a shoeholic at this point. She's appalled. She calls me Melda Marcos, which is not a good thing. Except for the shoe, like too many shoes, so I always have to ask the shoe question. Okay, and any outfit in particular you like? Are you a dress person, pants person?
Dresses,
shalom?
I like dresses.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. All right. Okay, well, I love to know these little tidbits. Oh, your favorite cuisine also. What, if you had Italian, Indian, Mexican, Greece, and I always find it fascinating how with cuisines, everything becomes Italian, Mexican. It's like, that's what you're eating, those people know.
I love Italian. I love pizza.
Okay.
I really like pizza.
So hopefully we will find pizza in your next collection of short stories. Yeah, your next collection of short stories, which is about traveling. I'm sure we'll see a lot of pizza in that. Okay. All right.
Well, thank you, Sonia.
No, thank you, Chaitali. It's my
Thank
pleasure.
you both so much. So we are going to encourage our friends watching at home to click this teal button to buy A New Race of Men from Heaven from Charis Books and More. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can go into the description of the book and click the link there and buy it from us. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. So thank you for watching with us tonight, and we're going to say goodnight to you.